The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, still smelling faintly of her father's study, of pipe smoke and old paper, and the particular ink he had always favoured, though he himself had been 3 weeks in the ground. Miss Rosalind Atwood recognised the solicitor's hand before she even broke the seal, and beneath it, folded carefully inside, a second and considerably older letter, written in her father's own careful, deliberate script, and marked, in the corner, with a single instruction that made her breath catch, to be opened only upon my death, and only by my daughter's own hand. She read it twice through, before she fully understood what it asked of her. Her father, Samuel Atwood, a man who had built a modest fortune from nothing but a sharp mind and a merchant's patience, had, in the final years of his life, extended a substantial private loan to a struggling aristocratic estate, structured under terms so particular, so carefully unusual, that Rosalind could not, at first, quite believe he had truly intended them. Should the debt remain unpaid within 2 months of his death, the letter explained, half the estate's holdings would pass, irrevocably and by binding contract, into her own hands, but only if she herself resided at the estate for the full duration of those 2 months, to personally oversee the settling of her father's affairs. She did not know then that the Duke who owed her father this considerable debt had already, upon hearing of her intended arrival, made his own quiet prediction to his steward, one that would, within 2 short months, prove to be the single greatest miscalculation of his life. Before I take you further into what awaited Rosalind at that estate, and what the Duke believed, with such confident certainty, would drive her away long before her 2 months were ever complete, I want to ask something of you. If stories like this one, stories of patient, underestimated women who outlast the powerful men certain of their failure, are the kind you enjoy, then please take a moment now to subscribe, so these stories keep finding you, and I would genuinely love to know who's watching tonight. Leave a comment below and tell me what city or country you're joining me from. I read every single one, and it always amazes me how far these stories travel. Now, let us return to that Tuesday morning, and to the estate where a duke's confident wager was about to unravel entirely. Alderbrook Hall, when Rosalind's carriage finally drew up its long, neglected drive, was not the grand and gracious country house she had half expected from her father's careful, respectful correspondence with its owner. It was, instead, a house in genuine and visible decline, ivy grown wild across its western face, half its windows shuttered, the drive itself rutted and poorly maintained. As though the estate's steward had long ago abandoned any pretense of upkeep beyond what absolutely could not be avoided. She understood, within moments of her arrival, precisely why her father's loan had been so urgently needed. The Duke of Alderbrook received her in a drawing room considerably grander than the exterior had suggested, though even here Rosalind noted the small, telling signs of a household economizing quietly and carefully, furniture rearranged to hide worn patches, a fire kept lower than true comfort required, servants fewer in number than a house of this size would once have employed. Duke Frederick Alderbrook himself was not the elderly, desperate man Rosalind had half imagined from her father's letters. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 35, with the particular composed, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life genuinely believed his circumstances could not, eventually, be managed to his own satisfaction. "Miss Atwood," he said, greeting her with a courtesy that felt, to Rosalind's careful eye, rather more performed than genuinely warm. "I confess I had not expected your father's affairs to require quite so personal an involvement from his daughter. I trust the terms of his rather unusual arrangement have been fully explained to you." "They have, Your Grace," Rosalind replied evenly. "I understand I am to reside here for 2 months, during which time I am to personally verify the settling of my father's loan, in accordance with the terms he set." 2 months. The Duke's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. considerable commitment for a young woman unaccustomed to country life so far from London society. I do wonder whether you have fully considered what such an arrangement will actually entail. She did not know then that this very question, delivered with such polished, dismissive courtesy, concealed a private conversation the Duke had held with his steward not 2 hours before her arrival, one that a housemaid, dusting the adjoining hallway, would later, quietly and loyally, repeat to Rosalind herself. 2 months, the Duke had said to his steward, with the particular confident amusement of a man certain of an easy victory. Give her the coldest room in the East Wing, keep the household's routines exactly as they are, and offer her no particular comfort beyond what strict courtesy requires. A merchant's daughter, unused to the isolation and discomfort of a genuine country estate, will beg to leave long before her 2 months are ever complete. And when she does, the terms of her father's contract lapse, and the debt becomes, once again, a matter for considerably more reasonable negotiation. She did not know then, arriving in that cold, half-shuttered drawing room, with her father's careful instructions folded in her trunk, that she was walking directly into a quiet, deliberate campaign designed entirely to drive her away before her presence could cost the Duke anything at all. The room Rosalind was given, as the housemaid had warned her it would be, was the coldest and least hospitable in the entire East Wing, a chamber that had clearly gone unused for years, its furnishings sparse, its single window draughty, its fire, she quickly discovered, supplied with wood only grudgingly and in smaller quantities than any other room in the house. She understood, within her first week, precisely what game was being played, and understood. With the same careful, deliberate patience her father had built his entire fortune upon, that recognizing the game was the surest way to refuse losing it. She did not complain. She did not write home, as the Duke's household clearly expected her to, seeking any excuse to shorten her stay. Instead, she asked, politely but persistently, for access to the estate's own account books, a request the Duke granted with visible, if carefully concealed, surprise, apparently having expected a merchant's daughter to occupy herself with needlework and idle correspondence rather than genuine financial scrutiny. What she found, in those first careful weeks of review, painted a picture considerably more troubling than simple aristocratic mismanagement. She did not know then that the estate's true financial difficulties ran considerably deeper than her father's loan alone, nor that uncovering the full truth of Alderbrook's decline would eventually reveal a betrayal within the Duke's own household that he himself had not yet fully understood. Old Mrs. Pierce, the housekeeper, one of the few remaining servants who had served the estate long enough to remember its more prosperous years, became, gradually and cautiously, one of Rosalind's few genuine allies within the household. It was Mrs. Pierce who first mentioned, in a hushed conversation over the mending one grey afternoon, that the estate's decline had begun rather more suddenly than a simple accumulation of ordinary debt might suggest. There was a fire in the old counting house, some 6 years past, Mrs. Pierce said, her needle pausing thoughtfully. Destroyed a great many of the estate's older records. The old Duke, his Grace's father, was never quite the same man afterward, God rest him. And the young Duke's steward, Mr. Faulkner, took on a good deal more responsibility for the accounts than any steward rightly should, if you ask my opinion on the matter, which nobody ever does. She did not know then that this single, seemingly incidental piece of servant's gossip, a fire, an overly powerful steward, a grieving Duke too distracted to properly oversee his own affairs, was about to become the thread that unravelled the true source of Alderbrook's decline, and the true reason the current Duke had grown so desperately, quietly dependent on her father's loan in the first place. It was in the estate's own account books, painstakingly cross-referenced against the correspondence her father had kept of his own loan's terms, that Rosalind first noticed the discrepancy that would, in time, prove everything. The sums did not match. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious to a casual review, but consistently, over the course of several years, small but steady amounts of the estate's income appeared to have been diverted through a series of accounts Rosalind did not recognize. Accounts that, according to the ledger's own careful notation, had been established and personally managed by the Duke's steward. Miss Faulkner, ostensibly for the purpose of covering various estate expenses, that, upon closer examination, appeared nowhere else in the estate's actual operations. She did not know then that Mr. Faulkner himself, aware of her growing scrutiny of the accounts he had so carefully managed for years, had already begun taking careful steps of his own to ensure her review concluded before it could reach any dangerous conclusions. The proof, when she finally found it, came not from the ledgers themselves, but from a locked drawer in the estate's old counting house, the very room Mrs. Pierce had mentioned, rebuilt after the fire, but still containing, Rosalind discovered during a careful search undertaken with Mrs. Pierce's quiet assistance, a small collection of the steward's own private correspondence, overlooked in the reconstruction, and left, apparently, entirely forgotten. The letters revealed a steward who had, in the confusion and grief following the old Duke's decline after the fire, gradually and carefully positioned himself as indispensable to an estate too distracted to properly question his management, diverting modest sums over several years into his own private investments, confident that the disorder of the estate's records, combined with the current Duke's inexperience and preoccupation with maintaining appearances, would ensure his activities went permanently unnoticed. She did not know then that revealing this theft would not only settle her father's loan considerably more favourably than the Duke had ever anticipated, but would also, in a manner neither she nor the Duke fully expected, begin to genuinely change how he regarded her. Before we continue into how Rosalind confronted the Duke with what she had found, and what it ultimately meant for the terms of her father's loan, if you're finding yourself invested in her story, now is a wonderful time to subscribe, so you don't miss how it unfolds. And if you have a moment, I'd love it if you left a comment below telling me where you're watching from tonight. Now, back to Alderbrook Hall and the confrontation that would change everything. Rosalind did not go immediately to the Duke with what she had found. She understood, with the same careful patience that had guided every decision since her arrival, that an accusation delivered without absolute certainty could be dismissed, deflected, or, worse, quietly buried by a steward with years of practice concealing his own activities. Instead, she spent a further careful fortnight cross referencing every discrepancy she had found against the estate's remaining legitimate records, building a case so thorough and so precisely documented that no reasonable examination could dismiss it as mere misunderstanding or coincidence. When she finally requested a formal meeting with the Duke, specifically insisting, to his evident surprise, that Mr. Faulkner be present as well, she brought with her not vague suspicions, but a carefully organised account of 6 years of quiet, systematic theft, documented with a thoroughness that visibly unsettled the steward long before she had finished speaking. "I believe, Your Grace," she said, laying out her findings with the same calm, measured composure she had maintained throughout her stay, "that you will find your estate's true financial position considerably different than you have been led to understand. Not because my father's loan has burdened you beyond reasonable recovery, but because a significant portion of what should have been available to repay it has instead been diverted for the better part of 6 years into accounts managed entirely outside your own knowledge." The Duke's reaction, Rosalind noted carefully, was not the practiced, composed courtesy he had shown her throughout her stay. It was something considerably more genuine, a slow, dawning realization that spread across his features as Mr. Faulkner's own composure began, visibly, to crumble under the weight of evidence he could no longer plausibly deny. She did not know then that this single confrontation, built entirely on her own patient, careful diligence, was about to accomplish precisely what the Duke's quiet campaign of cold rooms and grudging comfort had failed entirely to achieve. It fundamentally, permanently changed how he regarded the woman he had once been so confident would simply beg to leave. Miss Faulkner's dismissal, once the full extent of his theft was undeniably established, was swift and, by the standards of aristocratic households eager to avoid public scandal, remarkably thorough. The Duke, to his genuine credit, did not attempt to quietly bury the matter for the sake of appearances, but pursued proper legal restitution, a decision Rosalind suspected. Though she never asked him directly, owed rather more to her own quiet influence during their growing, increasingly candid conversations than the Duke himself might have readily admitted. With Faulkner's theft exposed, and a considerable portion of the diverted funds ultimately recovered, the estate's true financial position proved considerably healthier than either Rosalind or the Duke had initially believed, healthy enough, in fact, that her father's loan, once fully and properly accounted for, could be settled not through the desperate, grudging arrangement the Duke had originally anticipated, but through terms that reflected, with genuine fairness, exactly what her father's contract had specified from the start. The 2 months, when they finally concluded, arrived not with the relief the Duke had once so confidently predicted Rosalind would feel at her departure, but with a considerably more complicated set of emotions on both sides. "I confess," the Duke said to her, on the final evening of her contracted stay, standing with her in a drawing room considerably warmer, in every sense, than the one that had first received her, "that I did not expect, when your father's letter first arrived, to find myself genuinely reluctant to see its terms concluded." "You expected, Your Grace," Rosalind replied, with the faint, knowing composure that had carried her through every difficult week of her stay, "that I would beg to leave long before this evening ever arrived." "I did," he admitted, with a rueful honesty she had not expected from the confidently dismissive man who had first received her. "I am, I find, rather glad to have been mistaken." The final settlement of her father's loan, concluded precisely as the 2 months came to their close, granted Rosalind, exactly as the original contract had specified, a genuine and substantial half-share in the estate's recovered holdings, a fortune considerably more significant than she had ever imagined possessing when she had first read her father's careful instructions in that Tuesday morning letter. But it was not, in the end, the fortune itself that Rosalind considered the true measure of what those 2 months had earned her. It was the estate itself, genuinely, honestly restored to solvency, its theft exposed and remedied, its tenants and household staff no longer subject to the quiet economizing that had marked its years of hidden decline, and the Duke himself transformed. Gradually and genuinely, from the confidently dismissive man who had once wagered on her failure into a partner she had come, over 2 difficult but ultimately rewarding months, to genuinely respect. Society, predictably, found considerable material for gossip in the arrangement. A merchant's daughter now holding half ownership in a ducal estate. A duke whose careless wager had cost him rather more than he ever intended to risk. But Rosalind found, much as she once might have expected to mind such talk, that she required rather less of society's approval now than the confident, careful woman who had first arrived at Alderbrook's cold east wing might have imagined. She and the Duke did, in time, marry, though Rosalind was always careful, in the years that followed, to remind anyone curious enough to ask that the marriage had come considerably after the partnership, built on a foundation of genuine, hard-earned respect rather than any romantic notion of a duke rescuing a merchant's daughter from her circumstances. It was, if anything, rather the reverse. A duke who had once been so certain of a young woman's failure, quietly and genuinely rescued from both his own steward's theft and his own considerable pride by a patience he had never once thought to properly respect. She kept, for the rest of her life, Her father's original letter, the one that had first arrived that Tuesday morning, still faintly scented with pipe smoke and old ink, as a quiet reminder of the 2 months a confident duke had once been certain would drive her away, and had instead become the very foundation of everything she eventually built. She had not known, stepping down from that carriage into Alderbrook's neglected drive, that she was walking into the coldest room in the house. But she had stayed all the same. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing for more forgotten tales of English aristocracy, hidden legacies, and the quiet women history so often underestimated. And don't forget, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Thank you for staying until the very end.